Hi, hello, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for the very nice introduction. Appreciated. Greetings from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, where indeed our weather is actually quite nice, and we are able to play tennis a year round. So without that, I will get started. First, can anybody hear me? I have a couple monitors going on here, so I want to make sure everything is set up. I will make sure that I am sharing the right screen. If I can manage to do that, share, where's the share screen? Here we go.
Brilliant. That's great. We can see that, Natalia. That's working. Yeah.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Sorry, just one split second here. Okay. So I will skip the introduction. Again, thank you very much for that. I, first of all, very much appreciate the opportunity of speaking to you on this topic, which I feel is really, really incredibly important, both for regulated banks as well as non-regulated entities, whether you're banking technology or supporting sort of the ecosystem in banking or really any other industry that is moving money, that is susceptible to fraud, operational risk, IT risk, and things like that. And I think that actually covers so many different areas of all the industries that we're supported and surrounded by. So here is my fairly short, brief, or focused agenda for today. What I wanted to go through today, a little bit about corporate governance structure, governing the digital governance in itself, as well as a governance map. This is an approach that I highly recommend any, especially maybe new, budding, changing, developing, or reorganizing entities and companies to go through. A little bit about digital transformation and risk and compliance by design, as well as a touch on the operating model. I wanted to talk to you today about governance and about governance in the digital area, governing in a digital manner, but also governing the digital. So I will briefly start by saying that there's a lot of already readily available information and thoughts and best practices on how we should structure our governance and how that governance system should really live. So what do I mean by that? Firstly, for us that are representing regulated banks, I am representing one of those, as well as those that are not regulated or maybe more loosely regulated, not subject to banking regulation. I think starting with fundamentals is, for me, that's always the first step. So what's already out there and what are the key high-level elements that we need to really pay attention to make sure that we address? And one of the places that I always look to see is actually the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS organization out of Basel in Switzerland. They have corporate governance principles for banks. It's a document, and on one hand, if you have insomnia, you can read the whole thing. But if you just want to see a glimpse of what is contained, what are the different elements of governance, actually just looking at their table of contents is really quite informative. And we'll already start getting you some signals and pieces of information of what are the different pieces that you really have to think about when you start thinking about governance. So today, from that perspective, I wanted to talk a little bit about the governance structure, a governance map, which is an approach that I personally have taken several times already to help establish a good governance, a little bit about digital transformation and our changing operating models, especially what we have seen over the past year or so. And you might ask yourself, okay, well, Natalia, what does this have to sort of do with fraud? And I would say that this approach and really thinking about governance applies to many different things and fraud as well. So whether you're leading your fraud program, whether you head up operational risk, information security, or any other risk domain, or just corporate governance in general, I think this approach could be very, very useful. So I did have, for when I was actually connected to to the internet and to your conference, I got a chance to listen to a few of the presentations that are really insightful, very informative, quite technical. I should foreshadow that this is less technical of a presentation, and I'm really trying to address, okay, how do we look at it from a strategic, from a governance, from a holistic perspective, let's say as leaders and as decision makers that care about fraud and risk in our organizations. So the foundations are here. So, for example, from the perspective of the BizBank publications, and I just mentioned one of many, and a lot of different regulatory bodies, of course, have that. But there's so much more beyond that. There's academics, there's practitioners, there's consultants, and there's a lot of great practices out there that I have certainly leveraged and researched myself. And what I'll present to you today is some of those best practices that have worked very well for us. And I'll try to make them in fairly generic terms that can be applicable to any hopefully to many companies and organizations. So why governance? In my opinion, it is good practice and it is good business. And this really ultra-connected ecosystem of businesses, of clients, of transactions, we really have to have the clarity on how we conduct our business and under what system we as companies achieve our goals. So essentially what we're after is transparency and clarity, and that is both for ourselves, for our workforce, and for our clients and other stakeholders as well. Now, from the perspective of so that's sort of from the perspective of the digital governance. So all of that I will also explain a little bit later. How do you actually make this a digital approach, but also from the perspective of the governance of the digital. So we here absolutely really need to have clearly established governance structure for overseeing risks that are essentially stemming from complex algorithms, which we now see throughout our evolving organizations. And of course, there's no turning back on that. That is that the number of algorithms, approaches that use data, that use really complex algorithms is only going to increase. There's no going back. So many examples. For example, with fraud, of course, as I'm sure you have already touched on it, there's a lot of complex fraud detection algorithms, especially in the transaction-heavy industry, such as credit card. We have machine learning decision and approval in operations, for example, in credit risk management. We have, of course, automatic credit scoring, behavior scoring, in marketing advertising. There's also a lot of opportunities and in fact already a lot of models. And so we're talking about models, but those models are based on data, and they all sit in systems, and they all have been implemented with a particular strategy, a corporate strategy in mind. So all of that whole structure, sort of connecting your overall company strategy to how do you determine that the model that your analyst has built is really the right model for implementation and is actually continuing to function in the way that you want it to function. So these AI approaches, machine learning, as well as the more traditional, your logistic regression approaches they continue, of course, to be throughout our organizations, and really need proper governance around that. So what is governance? Let me start with that a little bit, just to get everybody on the same page. I think this is important. So first of all, it is, it's about decision-making bodies. It is your individuals that make decisions, your committees that make decisions. So that's your first element. The second element is requirements and prerequisites that are often including in your charters, your terms of reference, standards, technical standards, and of course, policies and other frameworks that you might have. So this is, so we have the people, and then we actually have the information that we sometimes have on paper, sometimes we have on the website and things like that. So there's that information. Thirdly, we also are, of course, subject to a lot of guidelines. that are coming either from law, from the legal side of the world, or from regulation, which may be law, maybe not yet be law. There's a variability there as well. And of course, various sets of controls that really guide the way that we execute and make sure that everything that we're doing, be it fraud, be it operational risk, or anything else, or just your day-to-day operations, that the control environment is strong to make sure that whenever there are things that are popping up and breaking down, you can really either prevent it or you can catch it quickly. So unfortunately, sometimes the concept of governance does not get a great reputation. And to the onlookers, that might seem burdensome or somewhat bureaucratic, or maybe slowing down progress. And that is sort of why I got interested in governance to begin with, is because I firmly believe that governance and that whole ecosystem can be just as fast as the rest of the organization. So the governance is not some sort of a business prevention unit, as of course risk has been named that a few times. I've heard that in my career, but it's really just as fast, as responsive, as sensitive to business needs as your business, as your operations are. And this, I think, becomes even more important to the front line. So often when we talk about governance, it's really about the corporate governance. So you're talking about your board of directors, your CEO, and various, sort of high-level committees. But actually, that governance, the governance approach that I will present, if it absolutely can be pushed down all the way to the front lines, and actually, that is exactly where you find the greatest bang for your buck, is when the individuals that are truly executing your operations have transparency, clarity, and all the information in their fingertips to make quick, informed decisions that are still within, the guardrails that are set by your governance and by your policies. And then one other piece of governance that I think is often omitted, that I absolutely wanted to talk about, and you'll see how that feeds into sort of the general sort of digital approach, that is accessibility and linkages. And what do I mean by that? Often, especially individuals that write policies or structure these governance systems, they are not as sensitive to the truly making these pieces, these requirements, prerequisites, guidelines, and such truly accessible. I'll give you an example. I was, at some point, I entered a new organization, and one of the things that I typically like to do first is I like to read some of their policies. I pick up the piece of document, and it is full of acronyms. It is full of jargon. It is full of language that I didn't understand. So was it accessible to me in my hand? Of course, I had it, but did I understand it? No, I did not really fully understand it. This is really what I mean about accessibility. It goes absolutely beyond simply being available to somebody in a format that they can read. It truly has to be able to be understood and to land and to make a link as to be between the person that's reading it and what's actually the content. And the linkages is actually that's the second part. What is also really important is to really explicitly and specifically outline what are the different linkages between the different elements of a governance system. And I will show you exactly what that means, I believe, in the next slide or two. So if you are a new employee, a new leader, or maybe somebody in the front line or back office, and you are coming in, or maybe things are just changing, maybe you're not a brand new person in the company, but things are changing. Often we change things sort of piece by piece. And while those different elements are changing, we don't truly understand how does it link to the broader perspective of who sets the strategy, who makes the decisions, what are the requirements, and things like that. So I think that is really important to actually make that quite explicit. So what can this look like? It can actually sort of look like this. This is a map. And I have embarked on an exercise like this already several times, and I find that it works really, really well. And again, I underscore here that this can be applied both to your corporate governance, to fraud governance, any other risk domain, and beyond. So whether you're doing this on a piece of paper, on a digital whiteboard, a real physical whiteboard, I would absolutely encourage everyone to sit down and really map out this kind of a governance system. And I will go very briefly through this, and feel free to peruse through the details. This is hypothetical, so this is kind of a generic view. But on top, you have your regulatory landscape. Make sure everybody really understands the regulation and the legal obligations that they are subject and required to abide by. Then you may have a supervisory board, maybe you don't. You may have a headquarters, for example. I work for a company that has actually worked for pretty much every single company that had a headquarters somewhere else, and I was working for a subsidiary. So there's, of course, an added level of complexity. But often in a headquarters scenario, whether you sit in it or not, that is the headquarters that sets the global strategy and the global policies. So write out all the policies that are actually subject, the organization, broader organization is subject to. And then you have often a audit department, especially in any banking and perhaps maybe non-banking financial services, but audit departments are really key. And really start thinking about and explicitly writing out what is the true relationship between these different bodies, between these elements. So for example, your headquarters, sort of your command there, they will set out your global policies. Then those policies are being verified by audit to make sure that everybody is compliant to them. Then if you go over to the right-hand side, that's, let's say, more of your local management. And there, again, you have a plethora of different elements that it's so easy to get lost within this unless you have a map just like this. So I am now on the right-hand side, on the more orange, light orange side of this. And of course, you have your local assurance functions. That is your risk compliance, your privacy officer, your information security officer, and such. And of course, you have your local policies. I didn't give any examples, but they would probably be your adaptation, either global policies or whatever local policies you may need to have given your jurisdiction. Those local insurance policies and the policy the local insurance functions and the local policies, help to steer and drive how we do business, right? So we have your strategy that is often set by your command center, your global, or total corporate strategy, and then your local assurance functions and your policies are sort of the guardrails that really say, okay, this is what we do, that's the strategy, and this is how we do it often. How do we execute a strategy in a risk-sensitive manner? Of course, you have a lot of committees. I can tell you, I've always been in organizations where there was a lot of committees, your risk committees, information security, fiduciary, IT. I'm sure you know this better than I do for how this looks like. Across the industries. But again, another level of individuals, committees that have mandates from very specific either policies or even maybe directly from regulation, because some committees are in fact mandated by regulation as an element of good governance. And then you have all the way to the right, you have even more details and even more elements, such as your control framework. So what are your minimum controls? Monitoring and reporting, including things such as risk appetite and making sure that you stay within the risk appetite, financial performance and commercial performance, for example, reporting, incident management, speaking of fraud, speaking of operational risk, compliance, privacy breaches. You have incident, of course, which probably attached to either a committee or a policy, and various assessments that go throughout, especially banks very often are subject to a lot of risk assessments, which I think, if executed well, can be very, very helpful. So again, sit down and draw out this kind of a map, and also take a step back and think about how easy it is to kind of get lost in this unless it's mapped out in this kind of a way. And this, in fact, could be simply your website where your governance is sort of housed in. So imagine that I enter a website like this, and I am a fraud model developer and I say, okay, well, how do I fit in all this? You might have a model governance policy. Maybe this is where I start and I see there's a policy, there's a standard. The requirements set out in the standard say that I have to have an X number of years of data that is required to be modeled upon. It has to be validated by an internal validation team, and it has to go through all the various sort of reviews and approvals and things like that, depending on how extensive or small your development process is. But you can very quickly say, also from the perspective of stakeholder management, okay, here's the number of individuals, committees that I need to reach out to make sure that I really bring everyone along on the journey here. So I would, this is part of the core of my presentation here, and I think this is one of the best practices that I have myself employed when it comes to governance, is sit down, write out a map, and then digitize it, and then make it accessible to your entire organization. Next. So we've seen the governance map. So make it digital. Here again, where it really helps you. The exercise of doing the map. Not only does it help you to map out all the elements, perhaps sometimes extremely extensive and really, really complex, but it also enables you to find the gaps of where you might need to tweak something or create something else, or maybe there's an overlap and you can actually simplify this. So this digital map and digital documentation that is easily accessible, not only in its availability, but also in its language. That's really, really important. And then, okay, so if we're moving more towards the digital, and how does it actually live? If you go through this exercise of the governance mapping, this actually becomes your blueprint, right? This becomes your blueprint of how the governance can be, in fact, built into your systems, be built into your information systems, access, approval systems, review systems, and things like that. And of course, we all know, especially those again in banking, there's a lot of processes around making decisions and around transactions, around new product introductions, and things like that. And all of that, in fact, can be really strengthened if you first have a blueprint like that in mind, because then a lot of these decisions, approvals, reviews, and things like that it helps to digitize all the rest of your ecosystem. This is my example in model risk. I actually just shared that with you about a minute or so ago. But if you imagine yourself to be someone in almost any function tasked with developing something new, be it a model, be it implementing a new system, bringing on a new product, either developing it or purchasing it, which for example, that is a really interesting example as well. Imagine that you're purchasing a brand new fraud product that you want to implement to help manage your fraud exposure, right? Having a map like this will fairly quickly help you understand who do you have to bring along, what are the requirements, is your scope, is it scoped out correctly, who else do you have to involve, and how do you make it a success? And finally, I will then transition to a rapid approach, and this is an approach that we also have used in my organization, which has turned out to be a really great tool for us, and I have a feeling that might be a great tool for you as well. It is not unlike a RACI, if you're familiar with that. It's a bit more simple as a RACI. RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, Informed, and a RAPID stands for Recommend, Agree, Perform, Input, and Decide. So who's got the D? Who makes the decisions? Now, why am I talking about this today? Because I think the governance, a lot of it is about making decisions. At the corporate governance level, and again, all the way down to when you have your front lines making, let's say, transaction level decisions, or approvals, credit lines, and things like that, or monitoring, alert handling, and things like that. So what we have done is we had implemented this decision-making approach, and this was originally developed by Bain, the consulting group. And what it does is it provides a framework to really explicitly outline who has what kind of a role in making decisions. And this can be applied to almost any decision. I would encourage you to take only sort of key decisions and strategic decisions, not like literally every single decision, because it might be too much. But for your key decisions, this really makes it crystal clear about who's got which role. So essentially what you would do is you would sit down, you would look at your process. If I'm going to take an example of credit approval, you might have different levels. So something, let's say up to $250,000, maybe $2 million, maybe anything above $50 million, right? You might have a different level of information that you require, of a depth of analysis that you need to make, and just in general, the number of people that might be impacted by this decision that you have to involve. So I will not go too much into this. You can easily Google the rapid approach and get a lot of information about how to actually implement it, including templates of actually putting this together, with the RAPID acronyms, the decisions. There's a great article by Harvard Business Review about who's got the D and who really makes the decision. It helps you kind of structure to do this. So if I bring this sort of together between the rapid that has worked for us very, very well, and it's all about who has the decision-making power and who do you involve and bring along with you. To the other side of the corporate governance, your huge ecosystem of sometimes very complex elements, people, documents, systems, responsibilities, and such. If you do this right, if you map this out and make it, again, digital and make it accessible to your workforce, then this really enables decisions to be made quickly. Now, I don't know about how your companies function, but of course, I think at some point in time, all of us have been faced with decisions that kind of got stuck in limbo, where people did not understand, implications on governance. They did not understand roles and responsibilities. They did not understand implications on operations and things like that. And within that, I think, sometimes there are moments where business functioning can stall a little bit. So I believe that I have 2 more slides left. So a little bit about digital transformation. This is just another lens and another example of where this is really quite important. I have been, again, in several companies that have gone through digital transformations, and it is really important, again, to truly understand the governance, who makes the decisions, why they're making the decisions, how are these decisions sort of safeguarded, how do they relate to your, for example, to your risk appetite and your strategy as well. So a truly important business transformation, a business process that will have implications possibly for a really, really long time. So really important moment for us to have a good grip on how that's taking place. And at this point, of course, you have your risk management by design, you have compliance and privacy by design. I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, have heard of these concepts before, but involving your risk and your compliance, privacy, information security colleagues early on to make sure that the products that you are developing are done in a safe manner. Gosh, especially privacy and data privacy is such an important topic these days. I cannot encourage you enough to involve your information security and privacy colleagues to the table really, really early on. And of course, there's many other examples here. So the robust governance around the transformation itself, who's the decision makers, who you need to involve from the stakeholder management perspective, who it will impact down the line, and what are, let's say, regulatory breach or such implications that we might be facing. So this is something that's probably quite important for your project management offices, your change boards, and such. And then last and not least, kind of reflecting back a little bit toward the past year and COVID and the COVID crisis that we have just gone through. Of course, we had to very quickly change our operating models. And I would venture to say that often our governance has not changed that much, whether it should or shouldn't. My personal experience was that perhaps our governance should have changed a little bit more, and what would have enabled this, a quick and agile shift, and your pivot to a different way of making decisions, to a different way of accessing information, and understanding sort of where you sit in the decision-making system, is actually having that digital governance approach. So certainly, this is not a tremendously let's say complex. If I'm thinking about putting together and implementing fraud detection models, this is actually a fairly basic exercise, and also a fairly fundamental exercise. So again, I encourage you to embark on digitizing your governance sort of ecosystem, your map, and all your information, and increased risks and importance of the governance of the digital. So that becomes more and more important the more algorithms, the more data-based decisions, automated decisions that we have within our organizations. This becomes even more important, and especially for larger and regulated entities. And that is what I had for you today.